So the question is there something that could be done more in order to relieve, at least to create some advantage with respect to capital taxation? And there I think there has to be some real serious consideration of tax reform in Alberta, with the idea of what many countries are following through with, and that is to shift taxes away from investment and savings towards consumption. And that is actually a policy that's being adopted everywhere around the world because of the concern over mobile capital, the attractiveness of having creating jobs in your own jurisdiction. And so countries have been all reducing corporate income taxes. They've been reducing other taxes on capital goods. For example, China, which had one of the highest effective tax rates on capital, has recently adopted a policy of refunding the VAT of 17% in China for machinery investments. They actually had a 17% tax, excise tax on machinery in China, where there was no refund given to businesses under their VAT. That was a huge tax. And China even recently has adopted that. If you go around the world, we're seeing all these policies now being adopted in terms of relieving taxes on capital, shifting towards taxing consumption, whether it's adoption of VATs or increases in other types of consumption-type taxes. For example, in California, there's a new proposal to abolish the corporate income tax, to abolish the retail sales tax, and to bring in what I call a business value tax. In fact, I've had some people in California the past 3 weeks in communication with me because it's a proposal that I made with a colleague of mine, Richard Bird, and we proposed a number of years ago of regional governments adopting this kind of tax where you put a tax on an accounts basis on firms at the regional level on their revenues and allow them a deduction for costs except for payroll costs and interest on capital. It's kind of like having a value-added tax on an accounts basis. And actually what California's, the reform proposal is effectively to move towards that system, which has been, by the way, been adopted in Italy, Hungary, and a few other countries recently as a way of trying to move towards a consumption-type base tax system. And so I think in the case of Alberta, I think there's some real consideration that could be given towards more taxation of consumption. For example, one could do it on a minor basis by using more excise taxes, which we already have in Alberta for alcohol, tobacco, etc., and gambling. One could have more excise taxes and try to raise more revenue that way, but also use more user charges associated with public consumption goods, including a number of areas, as a way of trying to raise revenue, all of them actually really moving towards a consumption-based type system, whether it's funding, whether related to public consumption or private consumption goods. That's one approach that could be used, and then use that revenue to reduce taxes on investment and savings. That could be one approach. A braver one would be for Alberta to adopt a value-added tax, maybe one harmonized with the GST. And I did a little calculation that if Alberta adopted an 8% value-added tax, it could reduce corporate and personal income tax rates by half. In other words, we could have a 5% corporate income tax rate and a 5% personal income tax rate with a 8% VAT. Now, I know suggesting a sales tax in Alberta is like, well, I guess it would be kind of like Galileo suggesting that in the times of the church that actually the earth revolves around the sun. And I know that's pretty heretical to talk about a sales tax here in Alberta, but it does tell you the power of moving towards a consumption tax in terms of what it could do and buy you in terms of major reductions in income taxes that would put Alberta at a much more competitive advantage, particularly with respect to capital. And then finally, one could adopt, as California did, a form of the business value tax, such as 5%, and that could actually allow you to eliminate entirely the corporate income tax in Alberta, as well as reduce some of the personal income tax by about a point in Alberta if you adopted that kind of base. Those are just ideas, and I realize that they're controversial. But I think if we want to tilt the playing field towards Alberta, I think Alberta needs to think about reform of its tax structure and not just looking at the level of taxes. And reducing taxes on investment and savings, I think, is going to be critical for the future and something that has to be considered. One final point, consumption taxes are also less volatile. And one of the things Alberta government needs to do is to make sure, is to reduce its reliability on very volatile revenues towards relying on less volatile revenues. Because public services aren't volatile. Spending on healthcare and education is pretty non-volatile expenditures that governments have here in Alberta. And if you want to try to make sure that you have a strong tax base to finance that, you need less volatile revenue, not more volatile revenue. And I think that should be a principle that Alberta should think about. And if we did shift more towards consumption and away from investment and savings, we will effectively achieve that as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jack. You've given us a lot to talk about. We have some time for some questions. And Jack taught me a while ago rules of engagement with questions. And I think it's a great process that if you want to stay on the topic that he's talking about, raise one hand. If you want to change it, go to the touchdown. You want to change your questions with a new question. So please feel free to ask Jack some questions now. No.
Jack, the assumption that debt, we don't increase the debt, what's happening across Canada generally? What's the competition doing? Are the provinces actually increasing debt generally or decreasing debt?
Increasing right now, of course. They're running rather large deficits. Ontario, for example, has officially an $18.7 billion deficit this year as a result of the recession. In fact, that number will be higher. They haven't announced it yet, but I know it will be higher because it was based on some earlier projections, and like the federal projections, the situation is actually worse than it is. And so as a result, their debt is increasing quite substantially. There's some provinces that have not really increased debt that much. Unlike Alberta was the only debt-free province in the country, so that's really quite an exceptional thing. On the other hand, we also have a huge amount of resources. Saskatchewan has been buying down its debt over the past 2-3 years, as well as Newfoundland. But of course, all that has stopped this past year. And we'll see once the recession is over and we start seeing growth in the economy again, whether provinces are going to get back on a track of trying to reduce debt, as well as the federal government. But certainly, we've seen some tick up. I should say the total government debt now in Canada has risen in the past year from about 38% of GDP. This is net debt. 38% of GDP in 2008. Today, it's very close to 40%. So there's been an uptick, and there will be an uptick, another uptick in the next year or two. But then we'll see what happens over the next 10 years. But to me, the real key issue is the fact that we have these resource royalties, and we're using resource royalties in Alberta to fund current consumption, like healthcare and education, and other services that governments provide. And so effectively, we're selling off our assets to pay for current consumption. And I think that's a key issue that we have to make up our minds in Albertans. Do we want to go further down the road and say, okay, we'll just raise more debt to avoid tax increases and maintain that tax advantage, and yet still not deal with, I think, a very significant problem, which is also selling off our assets to pay for our current consumption. Yeah, Joe.
Jack, how clear is the line of sight between having low capital taxes and the attraction of new investment in the province?
Well,
And then secondarily,
Yeah.
if that happens, what's the knock-on effect in terms of
Right.
other tax revenues that would be brought in as a result of the employment that comes from that investment?
Right. Well, I also have to remember that when you bring more people in, you not only increase taxes, but you also increase more demand for public services, which is part of the problem. But to get to the point, in the work that we've done, and actually in the paper that's outside, I have some review of some of that, very quick review of that literature. But basically, the story has been quite strong over the past number of years, that these marginal effective tax rates, and we're doing work on this ourselves, and it's been pretty significant, that we show that actually one of the things that we do is an 80-country ranking, and we now have 6 years of data, or 5 years of data, and so we've used this for our studies in foreign direct investment and things like that.